All right, sounds good. So we have up next, we have Dr. Devorah Siegel. And sorry, just making sure I got everything up here. Dr. Siegel is a pediatric neurologist at NYU at Langone Health, and she received her, and she is, I'm sorry, I had too much coffee already this morning. And she's going to be talking today about how to work with your care team to most effectively achieve multidisciplinary care. So I'm going to turn it over to her as I need to less caffeine, Vanessa, less caffeine. So take it away, Dr. Siegel.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for inviting me to address your conference. I wish I could be there in person and meet all of you in Denver, but I am, alas, stuck here in New York. So I guess one of the magical things we learned during COVID was how to be in two places at once. So I guess that's a silver lining here. So I'm going to be talking about collaborating with your medical team, and then also about clinical research and what clinical research is, how to get involved in it, what it entails. I'm going to share my screen in a second. Hopefully this works. Okay, sorry, give me 1 second. I have two screens, so it's always a little bit confusing. Okay, what do you all see? Can you see my slides?
We can, thank you.
Okay. And do you see the presenter mode or the regular mode?
No, we see the presenter mode. Everything looks great.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so so again, I'm going to be talking about how to collaborate with your medical team, and then we're going to talk about clinical research. So advancing. There we go. Okay. So we already talked about this, how to improve your child's care by forming a team with the medical personnel you're interacting with, discussing what clinical research is, the different types of research, and how to participate in clinical research. So first off, what exactly is a rare disease? You're all here because of rare diseases. The 8P, the Dup15q, and Ring14 are all quite rare diseases. And a rare disease in the US is defined as a condition that affects fewer than 200,000 people. So given the population of the United States, that's about 1 in 1,600 people. The EU has a slightly different definition, but it winds up being more or less the same thing, which is a condition that affects fewer than 1 in 2,000 people. So there are about, depending who you ask, there are about 6,000 to 7,000 rare diseases. So that means that collectively as a group, 25 to 50 million Americans are living with a rare disease, and worldwide about 300 million people are living with a rare disease. So even though each individual disorder is rare, as a group, rare diseases are not rare. And as a physician, we encounter them all the time, especially as a neurologist. Over 70% of rare diseases are genetic, and the majority of those genetic disorders start in childhood. So again, I'm a pediatric neurologist, and that's often one of the specialties that are seen first by children who have a rare disorder, because many have significant neurodevelopmental components to them. So this is just to give you a sense. These are some of the disorders that I have seen and continue to follow in my practice. Some of these are more common, like neurofibromatosis. I take care of hundreds of children and adults with neurofibromatosis. Others listed here, I might only see one in my entire career. So if you have a child who has a rare disease, you might be the only family with that disorder that your physicians will ever see. In fact, some of these disorders on this list have fewer than 10 people worldwide. So certainly the medical personnel you interact with, not only will they never see another child or adult with that disorder, but they most likely have never heard of it and will never hear of it unless you educate them and tell them about that disorder. So as a family member, a caregiver of someone with a rare disorder, you are going to meet many medical professionals over your journey, some before a diagnosis is made and many more after a diagnosis is made. And that includes your primary care, which will be a pediatrician and eventually an internist, neurologists, as we said, developmental pediatricians, and then every body system has a specialist attached, a medical specialist attached that you might come in contact with, from GI to ENT, psychiatrist, hematologist, dermatologist, and then of course the non-physician medical personnel like speech therapists, OT, PT, feeding therapists, ABA, etc. And many children and adults with rare disorders have multiple medical needs and end up really building a team of medical professionals that they work with over the years. So I apologize for the background noise. It's where my office is located. So if your child has a rare disorder, really, how do you build that team and who should be the members of your team? In an ideal world, there is an expert or a few experts worldwide who really know everything there is to know about that disorder. If you can find that expert and connect with them, that's wonderful. They might be in a different city, in a different state, in a different country. So it may be someplace where you go just once to establish care, or every few years. Or if there's a family conference like the one that you have now, sometimes there are multidisciplinary clinics set up as part of the conference. So you can meet a team of physicians who are familiar with your child's disorders, your child's disorder. But even if you can't see them in person on a regular basis, it's ideally, there should be someone who you can email and ask the big questions to. So, if there's a major medical decision to be made, you can reach out to them and say, well, how does this, my child's disorder play into this decision that we have to make, whether it's schooling or surgery, etc. You will need a pediatrician or an internist eventually, and most likely, like I said before, that physician will have no knowledge of your child's disorder, but that's okay. As long as they're open and willing to learn and are accessible for when you have questions, they will be really the anchor to your team. And then in terms of building the other members of your medical team, you really need people who are willing to communicate with each other. So what exactly, when you're looking for a specialist, there are lots of, I live and work in New York, so there are hundreds of doctors here, many neurologists, gastroenterologists, et cetera, et cetera. So what are you looking for in a neurologist, which is my specialty, or a specialist in general? And like I said before, you probably will not find someone who has experience with your child's specific disease. What you do want is to have someone who is experienced in children with developmental disabilities. You want someone who has experience with rare disease in general, even if it's not yours, because that way they have experience working with experts at other institutions. They know how to look up and find information that might be helpful for you, and how to work with families and with organizations. You want someone who's open to collaboration with experts in the field and who's willing to admit what they don't know and to learn from people who do know. Someone who is, like I said before, willing to communicate with the parents and with other providers, and that includes therapists, schools, sometimes a physician. Especially as a neurologist, we participate in school meetings just to help educate other people in a child's life about what their disorder means to them and how to address it. Someone who keeps current with the latest research and trials, because they might be the person who can introduce you to clinical research and help you participate in trials. And someone who's open to trying new things, when safe, of course. You don't want someone who's going to go completely cowboy on you, but a physician who's willing to try something new and different, even if there isn't a lot of information out there about how well it works. Someone who's willing to learn, as I said before, and key is someone who sees himself as a member of a team. So now, how do you prepare for your medical visits? As a parent and caregiver of a child with a rare disorder, you'll probably have many visits over the years. And it can be helpful if your child has complex medical needs to keep a binder or a file folder or some sort of organizational tool to keep everything all together. As a physician, sometimes we take a deep breath when a family walks in with a binder this thick, and we say, oh boy, this is going to be a long conversation. But actually, it's extremely helpful to us when someone comes in who's, let's say, 8 or 9 or 10 and has had years of seeing physicians before me, and all that information is easily accessible and well organized. Many parents like to keep an updated Word document where they just keep track of all the major medical events that happened in their child's lives. And that can be super helpful too. And you can either email that or bring it as a hard copy, just sort of listing, okay, this is when the diagnosis was made. This is, for example, when she was diagnosed with seizures. These are the medications we've tried. And then having a list at the end of your medical team and their contact information. Coming into a visit, it can be helpful to write down your questions or the topics to discuss in advance. Some physicians are more sticklers for time than others, but no matter what, you're going to have a limited amount of time to meet with that doctor. And if you know in advance what you want to cover and what your main questions are, you can make sure that you get through what you need to get through during the visit. You can always take notes during visits, and many of us are open to having parents record conversations as well. Never, just a pro tip, don't record without asking permission first, because some hospitals don't allow it. But if the hospital does, I, for example, am always happy to have parents record conversations when they say, you know, I just need to be able to go back to this afterwards, or I want to be able to share this with my significant other or my parent, my child's grandparents, etc. Nowadays, there is in April, I believe, there was a law passed called the 21st Century Cures Act, which says that physicians have to make medical records available to their patients and families in electronic form immediately. So that means that all test results, imaging results, and clinic notes are available, need to be made available to you right after the visit in electronic form. Most large medical centers have a patient portal system set up where you have either an app or a website where you can access this information, and definitely get access to the portal and have your child's profile linked to yours. There are different laws in different states based on the age of the child. So in New York, for example, once a child is 12, they have some autonomy with medical decisions. So you have to be a proxy to access their account. I won't go into all the details of that, but it is key to have access to the portal because that's the way that you'll be able to get to all of your child's medical records very easily without having to submit a request or call the office, etc. Often you can also contact the physician through the portal by sending almost like an email system. Before you leave, make sure that you get the doctor's contact information, whether it's through the portal, an email address, or by phone, and find out how they like to be contacted so that you can ask questions that come up or reach out to them in between visits. Really, the key when you're addressing your medical team and you're building your medical team, the key is collaboration. As I said before, if your child has a rare disorder, most of their physicians will never meet another child with the same disorder. So we're all learning from each other. When I have a patient with a rare disorder, I tell parents, bring me what you've learned. You might be on a Facebook group with 400 other families with the same disorder. You have access sometimes to more knowledge and information than I do. So if you learn that something is helping other parents or other families, let me know and I'll be happy to facilitate that. So for example, I have one patient with a very rare genetic disorder, and she told me that other parents on her Facebook group said that aquatherapy helped their child learn to walk. And I would not necessarily have come up with that on my own, but I said, that sounds great. It's certainly safe. It's worth trying. And sure enough, with aquatherapy, her child made amazing advances and is walking almost independently at this point. So Facebook groups for parents are a great resource. Disease-specific organizations like the 3 wonderful organizations represented here are a fantastic resource. Family conferences like where you are now are a great resource. I can't attend the conferences of the disorders of every child I take care of, so I rely on parents to bring information back to me. I'm always willing to have an open conversation and a discussion about what might work, what might not work. It doesn't mean that I'll always agree to try something. If it doesn't seem safe to me, or if it seems like unlikely to work, I might not agree to write that prescription or facilitate that, but I'm always at least willing to listen because I recognize that your accumulated knowledge is more than the knowledge I have if I only have 1 or 2 or 3 patients with a particular disorder. So don't be hesitant to bring up what you learn, share it with your medical team, and be that source of information for them. Now, so we're talking about treatment, therapies. What if there is no treatment? What if there's no cure? What if there's no specific medication for your child's disorder? You can still develop a treatment plan to address symptoms, and you can think about options for clinical research. So that's sort of my segue into the research part of this talk. So just, I guess, quickly, what do I mean by a treatment plan? You probably are all quite familiar with this. Physical therapy to address motor delays, hypotonia to prevent spasticity or stiffening of the joints. Occupational therapy can help with motor planning, coordination, sensory issues, which lots of kids have. Speech therapy, this is just an example of a non-verbal communication board. So there are many other, I'm talking mostly as a physician, but there are many other specialties that work together with us to help develop a treatment plan for children with neurodevelopmental disabilities. Okay, so back to clinical research. What is clinical research? Clinical research is any research that involves studying people. And there are two big categories of clinical research: observational studies and clinical trials. What exactly are those? So an observational study does not have a specific treatment or a specific goal in mind other than learning more about the disorder that's being studied. So people are observed over time without any specific intervention planned, and data is collected over time. That data can be from medical records. So if you're participating in an observational study at the NIH, for example, you may go down once a year and they'll check height and weight and take some and do blood work, maybe do an MRI, and all of that information will go into the data that's being studied and learned about for this disorder. And sometimes it's questionnaires. So if you are participating in what's called a natural history study, where we learn about what just happens over the course of a disorder, you may get questionnaires in the mail every 6 months or every year to update the researchers about what's going on in your life or your child's life. So for rare disorders, these, this could sound a little boring, like what's the point? We're not doing anything. But when it comes to rare disorders, especially disorders that are only now being discovered, we don't always know what happens as kids get older. What happens, we can diagnose a genetic disorder, for example, in a 2-month-old or a 3-year-old. What happens when that child is 30? Are there new medical complications that we need to be aware of? What happens with their development over time? And by doing these natural history studies, we can actually learn more about the course of the disorder and then figure out, well, what research questions need to be addressed next? Is epilepsy an issue as children get older? Is spasticity an issue? Do we need to think about clinical trials to address vision loss, for example? So the observational studies can inform clinical trials. Registries are one form of natural history studies where sometimes it's organized by parent groups where you just sort of sign up, put your data in online, and that way they can keep track of everyone who's been diagnosed with a particular disorder. And some of you may be involved in a registry and not even realize that this is clinical research. So that's observational studies. Clinical trials are where there's a specific intervention planned, and the trial studies the outcome and any side effects. So this is when most people think of clinical research, they're thinking of clinical trials. So for example, a trial of a new epilepsy medication or a new kind of therapy to see if it helps with walking. It could be a medication, a surgery, a procedure, non-medical therapy, as I said before, diet. Any of these interventions can be part of a clinical trial. Some clinical trials, like for example, the COVID vaccine trials, have a placebo arm. So some of the participants get the intervention or the medication and some do not. And those two groups are compared to each other to see what the outcomes are and if they're the same or different across the two groups. In rare disorders, there is generally not a placebo arm. And the reason is there are so few people who have that disorder that you can't really get enough people in the clinical trial to divide them in half and give half the medication and half a placebo. Just a definition of placebo is anything that is a harmless, ineffective substance that's given instead of the treatment or the medication. And usually it's what's called blinded. So the patient and the physician do not know if they're getting the medication or the placebo. Just in case, sorry, I should have said that before, but just to define our terms here. But like I said, when it comes to rare disorders, there's generally not a placebo arm because there are so few people who have it. So when they are, let's say, using a medication, they'll compare it to the natural history. Well, what would happen in this disorder if we didn't treat it? And we have decades of accumulated knowledge by studying people with this disorder. And now let's try to give this medication and see what happens compared to what we know about people who don't get the medication, as opposed to having a group that's actively being studied. Hope that was clear. There are 4 phases of clinical trials that you might have heard about. So preclinical, which is not one of the phases, is research that goes into developing a clinical trial. And that includes animal studies, studies using compounds in test tubes or microscopes, but not involving people at all. So again, back to my epilepsy example, a preclinical trial might be using a medication to control seizures in rats and see if it helps prevent the seizures. Once it gets to people, the human subject stage, phase 1 is where there's a very small group, usually 20 to 80 people, and that's primarily used to test the safety and side effects. They're not, when there's a phase 1 trial, the researchers are not usually looking to see if the medication works. They're just looking to see if it's tolerated and if it's safe. And it's used to help find the correct dosage. Once they're done with phase 1, they move on to phase 2, which is usually a couple hundred subjects. And that's where they start looking to see if the medication actually works. They're still studying safety, they're still studying side effects, but that's where they're starting to look at, well, are we actually getting the results that we want? Phase 3 is where there are a few hundred to a few thousand patients. And again, they're studying the effectiveness and also watching out for side effects. And after the phase 3 stage is when medications are submitted to the FDA for approval, medications or device. Phase 4 happens after something is already FDA approved. Even when it's out in the public and many people might be treated with the medication, researchers continue to study the drug and look for its effectiveness and any side effects. Sometimes it's only when thousands and thousands of people are taking a medication or getting a procedure that the side effects actually come to light. Now, if you're looking at these phases and looking at these numbers, you should be thinking, well, if only a few hundred people have this disorder, how are we ever going to get to a phase 3 trial? And the answer is you're not. For rare disorders, typically phase 1 and phase 2 are combined. So when someone enrolls in a clinical trial, they're looking at the side effects and looking at the efficacy at the same time, just because there are so few people in the world who have a particular disorder. So they're typically in rare disorders between 50 and 100 people enrolled. And the clinical research, like I said, is both to look at whether the medication or intervention helps and also if it's safe and what side effects might be involved. There are other kinds of research as well, and some of you might be involved in this research already, and that includes providing samples to researchers. So if there's a lab in France that's studying your child's disorder, you might have submitted blood samples to them, you might have had a skin biopsy to send to them, or genetic material, and they use the information that they learn from those samples to help develop animal studies and help develop clinical research and clinical trials. So sometimes it can feel frustrating to families because they say, well, you know, we sent blood samples to this laboratory and that was 8 years ago and we still haven't heard anything. Is anything happening with research into my child's disease? And just remember that the early stages take time. And if you're providing those kinds of samples, you're probably involved in very early stages of research, and it may be years before it gets to a point where there's a medication developed or an intervention developed. But even though it takes time and it can be frustrating, those early stages are key. Otherwise, we don't know where to go with our clinical trials. So how do you find clinical research to be involved in? There is a central clearinghouse, clinicaltrials.gov, where every research study that involves humans in the United States has to be registered. So you can go on clinicaltrials.gov, you type in the name of your disorder, and a list of clinical trials will come up. Every trial that's listed has the name of a coordinator, the name of the researchers who are running the study, and the contact information of the coordinator. So you can always just cold call them or cold email them and say, hey, is my child eligible for this? Alternatively, if you have a physician you're working with, they can reach out to the study coordinators, and I do that all the time for patients and say, hey, I see you're studying metachromatic leukodystrophy. I have a patient who might qualify. How can I get him enrolled in your study? And now back to the family groups and collaborating and taking the knowledge that you learn back to your doctors. Family advocacy organizations are just a major, major resource for clinical research. First of all, many researchers go to family groups in order to recruit patients. So if you're studying a rare disease, how better to find those patients than to go to the group that represents those families and say, who here is interested in participating in research? Many advocacy organizations will have a section on their website where they list ongoing research, and that's also a good place to be updated and keep on top of what's going on in the research world. So I often have families who will come to me and say, I was on the website and I saw this new clinical trial. What do you know about that? How can I get involved? And then I can do the legwork and look into it and reach out to whoever is running the study. So why should you consider participating in a clinical trial? If there's no approved treatment for a particular disorder, if there are treatments, but they just haven't worked for you or your child, you might be interested in looking into research options. And for many families, just knowing that they are contributing to the knowledge and understanding of their child's disorder is motivation to participate. As a side benefit, you have access to experts in the field and access to new treatments that might not be available to other people. If you decide to enroll in a clinical trial, what exactly does that entail? What happens? So usually the first meeting is with the study staff. You'll learn all about the study. You'll get a document listing exactly what the trial entails, what the different study points are, what they are going to give you or your child, what any possible side effects are, and you'll have opportunities to ask all the questions you have about the trial. You sign informed consent, and for children over about, I think, 6, they have to sign assent that they agree to be part of the trial, children who are neurodevelopmentally able to do so. And then there's usually a screening process. So you might have blood work done, an MRI, an EEG to see if your child is eligible for the study. If you're accepted, there's typically a baseline visit where, again, there might be labs involved, there might be a physical exam involved, and then you're assigned to a treatment or placebo group. Like I said before, in rare diseases, there usually is no placebo group. And then you'll have a detailed schedule of visits. It's usually a graph. I can untack it from my wall, but it usually comes as like an Excel spreadsheet, it looks like, and it lists what all the time points are in the study, let's say 6 weeks, 8 weeks, every 3 months, and what exactly is done at each of those time points: an exam, blood work, an EEG, a questionnaire, and all of that information is collected as part of the clinical trial. Often, even after the trial is over, there's a follow-up period where they continue to monitor your child for a few months or a few years to see what the long-term effects are of whatever they were giving in the trial. So if you do participate in a clinical trial, what's expected of you? So adhering to the treatment. If you're taking a medication, you're expected to take it as every day or as often as you're supposed to take it. Coming to all scheduled appointments, keeping track of your side effects and making sure to communicate that with the research team, and to keep them informed about any other treatments that you or your child might be taking. It is a major commitment to be part of a research study. Oftentimes, like for example, if you have to be seen every 3 months, there might be very little wiggle room about when you can make that appointment. Like 4 days on either side of the 3-month mark, you have to come in for that appointment. So that's something to keep in mind if you're considering participating in a clinical trial. From the study team's perspective, we are responsible to fully educate patients and families about the pros and cons of the study and why they might or might not want to participate. We're responsible to monitor subjects for any side effects from the medication, to update families on any new developments in the trial. If anything does come up related to the medication, we're responsible to make sure that the child gets appropriate care. And then after the study is completed, we usually can't give out information as the study is going on about whether it's working or not, what other patients are experiencing. But after the trial is completed and the results are reported, we're responsible for circling back to families and letting them know what happened and what the results were. So how, because this is a family conference, how do groups like yours contribute to clinical research? Often family groups are involved in the planning process. And that's because the outcome, what we might consider an important outcome as a physician may be different from what you as a parent consider an important outcome. So for example, one clinical trial I was involved in for a genetic form of epilepsy, the researchers wanted to study the number of seizures and whether that number of seizures goes down with the new medication. But when we met with parents, they said, hey, our children have hundreds of seizures a day. If we go down from 400 seizures to 200 seizures a day, that's not really a meaningful change for us. We're much more interested in language. Is this medication, by controlling seizures, going to help language develop? And based on input from families, we modified what we were studying. We still looked at the number of seizures, but we also included other important endpoints. What about the quality of sleep? What about the number of behavioral outbursts that we wouldn't have thought of as an important outcome, but were important to families? Family groups can also, like I said before, provide the patients and have parents and patients who are motivated and interested in participating in research and can help prioritize what should be studied as part of clinical research. Family groups can also help with funding. So many advocacy groups either fund research on their own or contribute to funding towards research. Recruitment, like I said before, and then advocacy. So parents like you are a key resource for advocating for government funding for research, for FDA approval when the time comes, and just raising awareness at governmental levels of rare diseases and what their children need to thrive. So coming back to collaboration, that's really what drives both medical care and research. And all of these pieces, the clinical trials, family priorities, patient priorities, et cetera, combine together to form progress when it comes to rare diseases. And that is it. Any questions? All right, thank you very much, guys. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
We do have one question.
Oh, great.
One question, sorry.
Sure.
I was running up from the back. Is Dup15q really considered a disease? I guess it goes with any of these. Speakers keep using that term. Where I live, the doctors say, stay away from the word disease and they prefer syndrome.
So that's a good point. I try to use disorder rather than disease. I don't know if I'm not maybe consistent about it. And I don't know if you feel that that's any better. You know, it's sort of a question of semantics, but I definitely hear, and thank you for making that point, that using the word syndrome rather than disease is maybe a more sensitive way to term these conditions or condition.
Raise your hand if you like the word disease or are okay with using the word disease. What about disorder? Okay. So I just kind of address this. So when we talk about syndromes are a group of a phenotype, what you see in person. That's things that you can clinically measure and that sort of thing. When we talk about the disease, when we're in genetics, that's usually what you kind of refer to. You're talking about something that like their actual genetics that cause it. So we need to figure this out, right? What should we actually like start calling these things? Because syndrome sometimes doesn't actually cover it either.
Right, and
because how do you put the genetics into it?
Yeah, and I thank you for making that distinction, and I just echo that. When you're talking about syndromes, you're talking about a collection of symptoms, and different children with the same genetic condition might actually have different collections of symptoms. So the syndrome, quote, might look different from child to child, but the underlying genetic cause is the same. So I think this is one area where having family feedback is so important for us. Are we using terms that are insensitive or that aren't meaningful to you? And how can we do better?
I think in terms of your care team, I think walking in and saying, I prefer this might not be a bad thing. This is something that's, I would prefer that you refer to it as this. And a lot of it, we call it 8P, we call it ring 14, and we call it Dup15q. We don't even say disease or disorder or syndrome. We just say what the genetic is. So it's an interesting conversation when it comes to that. But I think engaging your care team saying like, oh, this really triggers me, please don't call it that, would be a really good thing to come into and say, I find that insensitive, or I'm good with that. Well, thank you so much. Is there any questions from anybody in the peanut gallery? Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Siegel.
You're welcome, thank you.